you all for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk to you all a bit more about epilepsy and memory. As was mentioned, I'm a neuropsychologist, so most of my job is spent evaluating memory and other thinking skills and giving feedback in terms of what patients can do about changing some of their thinking problems that they have. So really today we're going to be focusing on memory. And first, I'm going to talk about just, why epilepsy commonly impacts memory. We won't spend too much time on that. I think it's really helpful to know, or at least have some sort of foundational knowledge. But I really want to spend the majority of today talking about the strategies or the what you can do about part of it, because I think that tends to be kind of the most impactful and have more kind of take home to it. So first, I just want to talk about the brain in general. So our brain is split into two hemispheres. So we have the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And I promise that this will be important later on as we're talking about memory. The brain is also split into 4 different lobes. So we have the temporal lobe here, which many of you might have heard about, especially since temporal lobe epilepsy is one of the most common focal epilepsies out there. And so the temporal lobe is just kind of on the side of your head, kind of right behind your ear. And then we have the frontal lobe. This is one of the biggest lobes of the brain, and it's right as the name indicates, it's right on the front of your brain. So kind of like the area right behind your forehead. And then if you kind of trace from your forehead going back a little bit further, that's where our parietal lobe is located. And then if we go back even further, kind of where our brain meets the base of our skull, that is the occipital lobe. Now, why this is important is that each of our lobes are known to control different thinking skills. So memory in particular tends to be associated with the temporal lobe, although some aspects of memory are also controlled by the other lobes of the brain, which we'll kind of talk a bit more about. I also want to give special mention to the hippocampus. This is a structure within the temporal lobe right here. And the hippocampus is particularly important in memory. As a neuropsychologist, when we're talking about memory, hippocampus is the most kind of common brain structure that's associated with memory. So a lot of memory storage occurs right in this area. And this is just a different view of the hippocampus. This is kind of if you took the brain and you flipped it upside down. So this is kind of the bottom side of the brain. The hippocampus is right here, and these are our temporal lobes right here. So you can see that it's a structure kind of deep within the brain, but it is often impacted by epilepsy, and one of the reasons why memory is a common change with epilepsy. So we know that epilepsy can cause changes in thinking, and because epilepsy is essentially, an electrical malfunction within the brain. Now, different areas of the brain can be differently impacted depending on the type of epilepsy you have. So for example, folks that have generalized seizures, those seizures tend to be an electrical malfunction that is generalized. It goes kind of across all of the different brain regions. Whereas some folks just have focal seizures, where the seizures might be originating from a very specific part of the brain. Now, the seizure might kind of migrate out of that area, but what we know happens is every time someone has a seizure and has that electrical discharge, it can potentially damage the brain tissue around it. And because these areas can be damaged over time by having ongoing seizures, we can see sometimes associated thinking changes. And those thinking changes are often specific to the location that these seizures are occurring in. So I'll give you a few examples of this. So with temporal lobe epilepsy, the seizures are originating from the temporal region. Because the temporal region plays a big role in memory and has that hippocampus as part of it, a lot of times people with temporal lobe epilepsy will experience memory changes. Whereas often folks with frontal lobe epilepsy might be more experiencing changes with things like attention, thinking speed, or executive function. And executive function is just an umbrella term to refer to higher order thinking skills, things like problem solving and reasoning. And then much less is understood about parietal and occipital lobe epilepsy, just because there hasn't been near as much research on these regions. But we know that in general, people with parietal lobe epilepsy can experience changes with visual organization and mathematical skills, while folks with occipital lobe epilepsy can sometimes experience changes with how they perceive visual information. And so, like I said, in general, we can see these different associations. And then once again, going back to the hippocampus, because it is so important with memory, something that's commonly seen in epilepsy, particularly temporal lobe epilepsy, is something called hippocampal sclerosis, or sometimes referred to as mesial temporal sclerosis. So if you've had brain imaging, you might have seen that you have these words mentioned in your brain imaging records. And so what that's saying is that your hippocampus, which is right here and right here, so it's on both sides, we have a right and left hippocampus. One of the hippocampi are reduced in size, so it's atrophied. And so it's smaller and it's probably not functioning as well. So it's very common that people with hippocampal sclerosis will experience memory changes because their hippocampus is showing that level of damage. Now, going back to those brain hemispheres, there's also a difference in what our right hemisphere is controlled for and what our left hemisphere is in control of. So in general, our left hemisphere is more focused on verbal and language abilities. So left temporal lobe epilepsy, often what we see are difficulties with finding the right word to say and problems with verbal memory specifically. So this is things like remembering a recent conversation you've had, or remembering items that you need to grab at the grocery store, or trying to remember a list of words or a story that you've been told. Whereas the right temporal, or the right hemisphere overall, tends to be more responsible for nonverbal or visual functions. So in particular, our right temporal lobe tends to be more associated with visual memory. And so this is things like remembering art pieces or visual designs or locations, like being able to find your way or remember where like an office was located within a building, things like that. And so once again, depending on where your epilepsy is coming from, it might affect what types of memory problems you're having, whether it be more with verbal memory or with visual memory, depending on the hemisphere that your epilepsy is coming from. So we also see differences there. And then also I want to mention that there's a lot of individual variability. So I'm talking kind of really broad generalizations here, but not everyone's brain is organized the same way. So like I said, usually language functions are kept in the left hemisphere, but that's not always the case. Sometimes people have language functions in their right hemisphere. Sometimes people experience changes with memory, and sometimes they don't. And even though memory problems are most highly associated with temporal lobe epilepsy, all different types of epilepsy can impact memory, because the brain is very complex. It's this network of systems. So if one area of the brain is impacted, it's very commonly that other areas are also impacted, even if it's more indirectly. So for example, someone with frontal lobe epilepsy can very well still have memory problems. And perhaps it's just that their temporal lobe is being impacted indirectly, or other functions of the frontal lobe are being impacted, which subsequently create memory problems. So it's very complex, but I just want to make it clear that the brain is complex and is a network. So any types of seizures can really result in memory problems. And then also when I do memory evaluations, it's very common that there's a lot of other factors that are impacting people's memory outside of just having seizures. So things like those anti-seizure medications can sometimes impact memory. Certain ones are associated higher with memory changes. And other things like depression and anxiety, which are fairly common in patients that have epilepsy, can also impact our memory and other thinking skills. So sometimes it's just the epilepsy that's playing a role, but a lot of times there's a multitude of factors. So let's talk about memory stages. And so when we talk about memory or think about memory, usually there's 4 stages associated. So there's attention, which is just focusing on what you actually need to remember, right? And so if you're not paying attention to the information you need to remember, none of these other stages are going to happen, right? So first, it's being able to focus and attend. The second stage is encoding. And so this is kind of what I like to think about is creating a file in your mind. So you're paying attention to information, you're saying, okay, I need to remember this. So I'm going to put it in this little file in my brain. And then the storage stage is just that file sitting in that filing cabinet in your mind, and hopefully not disintegrating over time. Hopefully it's staying there if it's something that you need to remember later. And then retrieval is the last stage of memory. So this is being able to kind of go back in that filing cabinet, find the right filing cabinet, find the right file, and then pull out or retrieve that memory. And so people with epilepsy can experience changes with one of these stages or all of these stages of memory. And so now I want to talk a bit about what we do from here. So if you have noticed some changes with memory, of course, the best that you can control your seizures, the better your brain is going to be able to function. But sometimes people have ongoing seizures despite medications or surgery or other treatments, or sometimes there's just no other options. Or sometimes you've, kind of are on the other side of things where maybe you've had surgery or have medications that are controlling it, but potentially still have memory problems from when you were having those seizures more regularly. So we can't always reverse what's been done to the brain, but we can lessen the impact of those issues. So if you've had memory problems, the best thing that we can do to help with those memory problems is learn how to compensate for them. And we can do this using both external strategies and internal strategies. And I'll talk about specific strategies in each of these categories. But just as an overview, external strategies are different aids that you can use to help your memory. And internal strategies are more like brain games or different ways of thinking to help promote your memory. Now, I usually encourage external strategies, especially for really important information, because external strategies are generally more foolproof than internal strategies. But sometimes we just can't use external strategies, and we have to rely on other methods of trying to remember a piece of information. And so that's when the internal strategies can be helpful. So let's talk specifically about external strategies. These are things like taking notes or writing lists, using alarm reminders to help you remember to take medication or pick up your kids from school or whatever it is you're trying to remember to do. Keeping a calendar is also very effective external memory strategy. Using things like medication organizers like pill boxes can be very helpful, as well as visual reminders. Now, what I find is that a lot of people use external strategies, myself included, but sometimes the effectiveness is not as optimal as it could be. So I think everyone knows how to use a calendar, how to take notes. So I'm not going to go over that exhaustively, but I do want to talk to you briefly about how we can make sure we're using these tools as optimally as possible. So I think that this little meme here in the corner captures what I'm referring to exactly. So it says, I would write it down to help me remember, but there's a good chance I'll forget where I wrote it. This is a very common statement that I hear. And so these are some methods to help with this kind of note-taking or note-keeping, list-making strategies. So first off, it's really important to keep notes and or lists in a centralized location, and you keep them there regularly. So a lot of times what I'll see is patients that have a bunch of notebooks and they're constantly taking notes, but there's no organization to them. And so they don't really know which notebook to take out, to refer back to for certain things. And so what I usually encourage those folks to do is eliminate multiple notebooks. We just need one, keep it central so that you can write everything down in that centralized notebook, and then you'll know better where to find the information when you need it later, right? So try to keep those things as streamlined as possible. And sometimes making certain like lists or reminders, if you use like sticky notes, sometimes it can make sense to keep it in a specific location. So for example, a way that some people remember medications is by taking them right after they brush their teeth or right before they brush their teeth. So keeping a sticky note on your bathroom mirror that has that little reminder of take medicine can be helpful. But if you're taking a lot of notes or like making a lot of sticky notes, if there's not a reason for it to be in a specific location, try to keep it in just one centralized location and try to keep them as organized as possible. So having a bunch of sticky notes over a board is very overwhelming and you don't really know where to focus your attention, right? So if you're taking sticky notes, if you tend to write down things like things you have to do for the day, a grocery list, and important contact information that you want to keep on hand. Well, organize those appropriately. So have a column for the, your grocery list, have a column for your to-dos, have a column for your important information. The more organization that you have to these skills or these strategies, the more effective they're going to be. The other thing is make notes detailed enough to where you can actually remember what you were referring to. I don't know about you, but there's been plenty of times where I take a note and I look back at it a week later and I have no idea what I'm talking about. And so if that happens to you, make sure you're writing enough information down to actually be able to remember what you were talking about. Also, write things down immediately. If you know you want to write it down and you want to remember that, so let's say, for example, you schedule an appointment, but you schedule the appointment while you're doing some other things. And so you kind of think to yourself, oh, I'm going to write this down in my calendar as soon as I pour this cup of coffee, and then I'll go write it down. There's a much higher chance that that appointment is never getting written down, right? So it's important to make it a habit that you're writing down things or, adding appointments to a calendar immediately after you schedule them, and don't do any task, no matter how simple it might be, in between, because like I said, it will just increase the chance that you'll forget to do it. And make it a habit to check your notes, to check your calendar, to check your lists. This can be one of the hardest parts. So there's plenty of times where people come to me and they say, I write all these things down, I keep a calendar, but I'm still missing appointments because I forgot to check my calendar that morning, and these things it's when you write the appointments down or take a note, it does help that encoding process of memory. But once again, as a fail-safe, you should be referring to the notes later. And so when you're first starting something like this, especially if you feel like you're one of those people that, maybe you keep a calendar, but it's not 100% effective because you forget to check it, start doing it a bit more intentional by using other strategies to increase that habitual response or make it a routine. So often what I tell people to do is if you're trying to use a calendar more regularly, set an alarm in the morning when you're usually free. And as soon as that alarm goes off, that's your cue. Oh, that's right. I need to go check my calendar, review whether or not there's any appointments or anything I need to prioritize for the day. Another thing that you can do is pair it with an already established routine. So if you're a breakfast person and you eat breakfast every morning, have that be your cue. Oh, I'm eating breakfast. It's time to check my calendar. Let me review what I need to prepare for the day. So these things just help it become a more routine habit so that it is more fail-safe. Something that I really like to develop is what's called a memory notebook. And I've actually done research on teaching people how to use memory notebooks. And so I find this very helpful. So memory notebooks are essentially a centralized system for things like your calendar, notes, lists, reminders, and any other important information like medical information or contact information that you always want on hand. This is an example of what a memory notebook might look like. Now, as you look at it, it's nothing special. This actually looks like most planners do. So sometimes people create their own memory notebook, while other people just go to their local store and flip through some planners that generally have this type of structure and find what works best for them. So with the memory notebook, the advantage is that it really gets you in the habit of utilizing these external strategies. So as you can see on this example, one side is just a simple calendar broken down by hours so that you know exactly when you might need to be doing certain things. The other side is a to-do list as well as any important reminders. Now, why this can be helpful is because when people use something like this, I tell them to carry things over day to day. So it gets you in the habit. You have to recreate your to-do list and write down any important reminders every day. So for example, in the morning, you would open this memory notebook, you look at what you have to do for the day, and then you would refer back to your to-do list from yesterday. And anything that you didn't finish from your to-do list yesterday goes on the new to-do list. So now it's at the top of your mind, right? You've remembered it, it's right there. You know that you didn't finish it, and now you need to finish it. It also helps with prioritizing things. So when you're thinking about your to-do list, you can think, okay, is there anything I need to add to this to-do list? Is there anything that's less urgent that can kind of go on the bottom? And if I have to transfer it to the next day, that's okay, so be it. Or are there any things that I really need to prioritize? Once again, it just helps kind of force that structure and organization to your day. And same with the important reminders. Some reminders might fall off after you've written them down so many times and reviewed them day to day. They either A, may be irrelevant, or B, may be pretty well encoded by the 10th time you've written it down. Or if not, you can continue to write them down. And if you ever need to refer back to previous reminders, you have them all in that centralized memory notebook. Now, some people opt to use technology, and some people are really comfortable with using a cell phone for essentially their memory notebook, right? So most of us probably have smartphones, right? And so there's certainly a calendar app as well as a note section, which you can create, like the to-do list, the reminders. And if that works for you, excellent. I will say though, for people who I've taught to use the memory notebook, they often find having a physical planner to be extra beneficial, at least while they're kind of starting to use these strategies, because it's something a bit more physical. They kind of recognize it as something extra that they have on them that they need to do. Whereas your phone is just a little easier to forget about if it's just an application that's on your phone that you don't really have to think about. So there's pros and cons. Most certainly with a smartphone, you can set alarm reminders and things like that. So that can be helpful. And so once again, pros and cons to each strategy. For a lot of people, a physical memory notebook works well. For other people, using applications on their smartphone to basically mimic a memory notebook is perfectly adequate. It's all about figuring out what works for you. And speaking of phones and technology, I do find that technology is one of the most beneficial things that we can use in terms of trying to reinforce these external strategies. So there's a lot of different note-taking softwares and applications that exist. I've listed two here that you can look into. These are pretty complex, but if you really want to be detailed oriented and organized, these can be helpful above and beyond just like maybe your note application on your phone. If you are the type of person that really needs to work on medications, or you want to start tracking your seizures more closely, there's a lot of applications for medication tracking and seizure tracking. And sometimes these are combined too. Some of the seizure trackers also have some medication tracking capability. So I think finding what works best for you is like just downloading some of these applications if that's something that you're interested in, and trying to see which ones are most appropriate for you can be really helpful. So, and I bring these up because some people, once again, will just use either a calendar to track their seizures or their alarm on their phones to help remind them of their medications. But there are some extra functionalities that these applications have. So for example, with like the medication reminders, an alarm on your phone is great. And if that works for you and you have a system down and you're taking your medications 100% of the time, great, you can tune out this next part. But if you have difficulties, these extra applications, downloading an extra application can be helpful, because not only can you set up alarm reminders, it will also confirm whether or not you'll have to confirm whether or not you've actually taken the medication. They can track things like whether or not there's been an increase in your medication dose or any associated side effects. You can more readily access your medication history. So things like that do have, so some of these applications do have added benefit like that. Same with the seizure tracking. A lot of them will have things like ask you questions about what types of seizures you had, what medications you're taking, if there were any triggers that day. And so if you're wanting to gain more insight of those things, actually having a separate application outside of just like writing down in your calendar that you had a seizure can be useful. And these last two, I'm actually going to talk a bit more about and give you some examples. I'm going to preface this by apologizing for anyone with like a Samsung or non-Apple phone. I am an Apple user and I really only know iPhones. And so these examples are all taken from an iPhone. So I apologize, but I'm sure that other phones have similar capabilities. It just might look a little different for here. So this is a picture of my cute little dog, Ruby, when we were on a hike. And I show this because I just want to point out a few different features of the Photos application on your phone. So whenever you take a photo, it's, as long as your settings are turned on appropriately, it's usually tracking exactly where the photo was taken, as well as what time the photo was taken. And if you click on the little eye icon, once again, that's for Apple specifically, it will even pull up more detailed information and tell you exactly where you were when you took that picture, which can be helpful in terms of just remembering information. So if there is like a specific location or thing you want to remember, snapping a quick picture of that will help you easily refer back to that later. And then also this icon right here and here, what it's saying is it's identified an object in this photo. And the object that it's identified is a dog. And I will say that this is almost creepy because my dog is half Boston Terrier and half French Bulldog. And so when you click look up dog, it pulls up exactly what kind of dog my dog is, even though she's a mixed breed, which was pretty interesting. And I like this feature, especially if you're having trouble remembering like the right word to say. If you snap a picture or have a picture of that item that you're trying to come up with the word, then you can look at the picture, click on this little icon and click, and then it will probably pop up the word for you, and unless you're looking for something more specific, and then you can click look up. And then, if you were trying to think of the word Boston Terrier, that would be one way you could get to it. So I find this useful for several different reasons. And then also, once again, organization is key. So for example, I really enjoy hiking. And because I go on a lot of different hiking trips, there's certain hiking trips that I really want to remember, or spots that maybe I want to come back to, right? So one way you can do it is just obviously have a photos album for your different hikes, so you can organize things that way. One thing that I like to do though, is I like to find a picture that is specifically something that I'll remember from that hike. This is probably not the best idea or example. In this case, if I was really trying to remember the falls we went to, I would probably select a picture of the falls. But what you can do is you can select the picture in your Photos app, and then you can click Notes, and it will automatically add it to a notes. So I have a note that's for hikes specifically, where I record all the hikes that I might want to return to. And so then I can click Save to my hikes note, and then type in where we were, and it will include that location as well as the picture attached to it. So then I can go back into my notes, and I can just look at all the hikes with the associated pictures and whether or not I want to go back to it. So that's another functionality there. Also, if you have Google Maps on your phone, and this is whether you're, Samsung, Apple, or otherwise user, if you have Google Maps, you can turn on something that's called Timeline. So if you open your Google Maps and you go to your profile icon right here, it will pop up this. And if you click your timeline, it will then take you to this window. Now, I don't have timeline, or at least when I created this slide, I did not have timeline turned on. So unfortunately, I can't show you an example of what it looks like, because basically it's telling me, we're not saving this data right now. So I would have to click review settings and actually turn it on to be able to track me. What if it was turned on, what it would show you is exactly the locations that I've been to in the past, either today or in the past. And so I find this to be really helpful. I've used it in the past to remember different restaurants or places I visited. So for example, my boyfriend and I went on a trip to New York, and along the way home, we stumbled upon a barbecue place that we absolutely loved. And we were going back to that area a year later, and we were like, what was that barbecue place? We couldn't remember what it was called. We couldn't even remember the town that it was in. And we really wanted to go back to it. So he opened his Google timeline. He could search the trip. He found the trip almost immediately and found that exact barbecue place that we wanted to visit. So I think that can be useful if you want to, remember, where you've been, or if you have trouble remembering restaurants or locations that you've been and you want to have that information recorded. Some people don't like to have that information recorded, and that's also perfectly fine. Another functionality here too is location sharing. So if you have a loved one where you really want them to know where you're at or to be able to track your location, and they also have Google, you can share your location with them so they can open up Google Maps at any time and see where you're at. Once again, there's pros and cons to these different things, but if you do have a trusted friend or family member where you feel like that would be helpful for you, it would give you a kind of a sense of safety or comfort, then that's another option. So let's talk about internal strategies now. Like I said, I put much more reliance on external strategies because they're much more foolproof, but internal strategies can come in handy in a pinch. So these are the different internal strategies we'll discuss in more detail. So first, mnemonics or acronyms can be very helpful. I think most people are fairly familiar with this strategy. But essentially what you do is you take the first letter of each concept or word that you're trying to remember, and then you create a new word out of it to make an acronym. So some of the most common acronyms that folks might be familiar with already are PIMDAS. So I learned this one in school. I learned it as, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, but I know that there's some other iterations of that out there. And this is to help you remember the order of operations for mathematical equations. So even though you remember it as "please excuse my dear Aunt Sally," what it stands for is parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. And that's the order in which you should complete an equation. Another common one is Roy G. Biv. This is to remember the colors in the rainbow. So you can remember the name Roy G. Biv might be able to stick in your mind, and then you'll know that the colors of the rainbow are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And so creating your own acronyms can be really helpful. I know for me, when I was still in school, I created acronyms for everything because I just had a hard time remembering, loosely related constructs. And so by creating an acronym, it really helped me tie them together and help me retrieve them when I was like taking a test or needing that information. And so you can create your own acronyms to help your memory recall. Clustering or chunking is another very common internal memory strategy. So this is taking a large set of information and then chunking pieces together to make it a bit more easily digestible. Let me show you an example of what I mean. So go ahead and try to remember these numbers: 5, 2, 8, 4, 2, 9. That's a lot of individual pieces to remember. That's 6 individual pieces. However, let's look at the numbers this way: 52, 84, 29. Now, all of a sudden, you're only having to remember 3 numbers rather than 6 individual numbers. And it can be chunked even further like this. So 528 and 429. So remembering 528 and 429 is probably a lot easier than remembering those 6 individual numbers. So this also works for things like a grocery list. If you chunk things by groups, like all of the fruits together, all of the meats together, that can be another way or form of chunking to help you recall that information, because then it's just more easily organized and will help promote that memory system in terms of the ease of retrieval. It makes it, if we go back to kind of the memory system, when you're learning individual memories or individual chunks of information, each one of those might require a file. But if we can combine those files, it's going to be a lot easier to retrieve that information when you need it. Method of loci is another really good internal strategy. I find that this one is particularly polarizing. People either love it or hate it. So use it if it works for you. I do think the whole concept behind it's really interesting. So what you do is you picture a familiar location or space, like your home. And then in each room, for anything that you have to remember, like if you have to remember 5 or 10 objects, you picture one of the objects or items in each of the rooms as you kind of mentally walk through your house. And the more exaggerated or silly the visualization, the better. And that really stands for all of these strategies, by the way. Using humor or exaggeration will help that information stick in your mind. So let's go through an example of this because it's kind of difficult with just an explanation like that. So let's pretend you have to remember this grocery list here. So you need milk, eggs, ham, apples, and body wash. Now, the simplest application of the method of loci is just simply picturing these different items in your home. So I'm going to use this home as an example, but when you use this method, you should be using your home. It should be something that you are able to picture because it's something that you're very familiar with. And the more detail, the better. And that's why a familiar location to you is an important note there. So the simple version of this is you picture yourself walking into your house and seeing some apples on the side table before you walk into the kitchen and see some eggs sizzling on the stove. And then you picture yourself walking to your fridge and grabbing a carton of milk before going upstairs and walking into your bedroom where there's a ham laying on your bed, quite odd, but that leads you into the bathroom where you see some body wash on the edge of the tub. So you've just pictured each one of these items in the space. That's useful. But once again, the more silly and exaggerated, the better. So I'll give you another example, something that might stick a little bit more in your mind. So I want you to picture walking into your living room and there's a pig running all around, knocking all of the furniture over, making a mess. This is, of course, the ham you need to remember. You chase the pig into the kitchen, and then in the kitchen there's an egg, in the kitchen there's a chicken, and this pig is attacking this chicken, and it pops out a bunch of eggs as it's being attacked by this pig. And so there's your eggs. And you're scrambling around trying to get these two to stop fighting, and they run up the stairs. And so you go chasing after them, but they're toppling all sorts of things over. And so they topple a bowl of apples at the top of the stairs. So now you're tripping up the stairs, trying to avoid all the apples coming down as you race up the stairs to get this pig and this chicken. And when you get to the top, you see a bunch of suds coming out of the bathroom. And so you go into the bathroom and you see the pig and chicken in the bathtub washing themselves with some body wash. Obviously very outlandish, hopefully not a real story at all, but are you going to remember those items better than you would with the first version? Most likely so, because now it's just kind of more vivid. It's more ridiculous. It just sticks in your mind a little bit more. And you don't have to go so crazy. So you can just kind of modify things even slightly. So for example, picturing the ham on your bed. Instead of just picturing a ham on your bed and thinking that's odd, you picture a really big ham in a nightie, and you know, kind of just make it really silly to help that visualization really stick in your mind. Now, this is only good if you're trying to remember like 5 to 10 things. So, you know, it's not a great way to remember an exhaustive list, but it can be helpful to remember kind of a short number of objects or items. Verbal and visual associations can also be helpful. So your memory always benefits from dual encoding. So what I mean by this is, once again, we have both verbal and visual memory, as well as other types of memory like motor memory. And so the more types of memories that we can use, or the more ways in which we can encode a memory, the better. So if you can encode information through both visual and verbal means, that's going to help the memory stick in your mind more, especially if you have one of those epilepsies that might be only affecting one hemisphere, because it might be that your verbal memory is weak, but your visual memory is quite strong, or vice versa, just depending on where those seizures are coming from. So utilizing the type of memory that's the strongest can be useful, or just using both types of memory can really help that memory encode much better and stick in that storage file much better. So I'm going to go first with the example of trying to remember a name. So a popular verbal visual association for remembering names is you think of an image related to the name. You pick out a prominent feature of the person's face, and then you attach that prominent feature to the image. So let's say you're at a party and you meet someone named Conrad. And the first thing that you notice is that he has kind of largish ears. That's just like one of the features on his face that stick out to you for whatever reason. And so we break that down. Let's say when you hear the name Conrad, you can't really associate anything specific with Conrad in and of itself, but to you, it kind of sounds like the word con plus the word rat. And so you picture a con riding a rat, and you picture the con riding a rat running into an ear canal. So now you've made that association of the name and what it sounds like or reminds you of to the prominent physical feature on that person's face, the ears. And so next time you meet Conrad, you're going to think, oh, ears, what weird visualization did I have associated with that? And then you're going to think of a con riding a rat running into an ear, and hopefully you'll eventually get to Conrad. Now, this can be a lot of mental effort, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You can also use this to remember specific facts. So, for example, this is a picture that you might visualize if you were trying to remember the capital of Bulgaria. So the capital of Bulgaria is Sofia. So how this breaks down is Sofia, you think of sofa. Bulgaria, you think of a bull named Gary, because Bulgaria, bull plus Gary kind of works. And then when you want to remember that that's the capital, like that's the association, you picture a cap with a really tall spinny thing, capital, right? And so then ultimately the vision is a bull named Gary sitting on a sofa with a cap with a tall little spinny thing. And that can help you associate back that Sofia is the capital of Bulgaria. Once again, it can be quite a bit of work, so it just depends on what you're trying to remember. It can be useful in certain situations, though. The other thing I just want to briefly mention is space retrieval. So obviously rehearsing information helps that encoding process. So the more we repeat that information, the better the encoding process is going to occur. And then a trick to that is using space retrieval for when you rehearse that information. So if you look at this chart, here's where you first maybe learn a piece of information, and here's the normal forgetting curve. So over days, right, over time, you're going to have this natural decline in likelihood of remembering that information that you learned here. However, if you learn the information and then you repeat it just a few days later, well, then all of a sudden your projected forgetting curve becomes much less so. And then if your second reminder happens about 10 days out, then that forgetting curve is even better. Then the third reminder is a little bit further out at 30 days, then we're looking pretty good. And if you can remember that information even 60 days later, that information's probably sticking in there. And this can be on a much smaller scale too. So this for me is one of the techniques that I probably use most commonly for remembering people's names, because I am not I'm not a person that's great with names. And so after hearing someone's name, I try to repeat it in my mind, or you can repeat it out loud, which is actually even more effective. But I try to repeat it immediately after they say their name. And then like 30 seconds into our conversation, I just try to mentally rehearse it again. And then like 2 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later, and then by the end of the night, that name has probably, stuck with me. And so having that kind of gradually increasing time interval though between rehearsing can be really effective in making sure it gets in there. So those are all of the internal strategies that I was going to review. I do want to also just give a note on different ways to optimize our thinking skills in general. So we know that the healthier our brain is and the better it's functioning, the better our memory will be. So these other things like managing stress, making sure you're getting good sleep regularly, eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, and staying social are all really important factors in making sure that your brain is as healthy as it can be and therefore functioning to its most optimal ability. And so beyond just, utilizing the different internal and external strategies we just reviewed, you can look through this list. And if there's an area that you really struggle with, like you look at this list and you immediately say, oh, I've always gotten terrible sleep. Well, that's an important area to target and to try to improve upon going forward. Or if you didn't realize that exercise was actually quite important for our brains, that's a good place to start, and just making sure that you're doing these things to keep your body as healthy as possible. Because if your body's healthy, your brain's healthy and it's functioning as best as it can be. So I didn't have time to speak about all of these, but I promise you these are very important to your memory functions as well. And before I wrap up, I just want to mention other resources. If you're really struggling with memory, and or you found these strategies interesting to learn about, but maybe difficult to actually execute in your life, there are resources out there to help you. I commonly refer patients to speech therapy. Speech therapists focus on memory outside of just speech. They don't just focus on language. And so they can teach these memory strategies and help you implement these different memory strategies in your day-to-day life. They also help with other thinking skills too. So if you're having problems with attention or reasoning or other things like that, speech therapy can be very useful for kind of all of those different areas. And then another thing that I just wanted to mention is there is a online program called Hopscotch that came out of Dartmouth Hitchcock Institute. So I'm not associated with it at all, but it is part of the Managing Epilepsy Well network. And so this is a program that helps you once again incorporate different compensatory strategies like the ones that we reviewed to help with thinking skills. And it's designed specifically for patients with epilepsy. And because it is something that can be accessed virtually, it can be a resource for folks all around the world. And so that's another resource that I like to point out if you're really struggling with this, this area. And with that, I think I left 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much. That was such a very, very interesting presentation.